Kent. But he, to formulate his power base, he marries Acca, who is Alla's daughter, Edwin's sister. So she becomes his second wife, and he brings her back to Bamburgh. But because he's married her, he has a claim then to the Jurian throne and the Bernician throne. So this is the start of Northumbria coming together. Basically, Northumbria is these two kingdoms, but he doesn't have a legitimate claim, but he has married the daughter. So he brings her back to Bamburgh. Bamburgh was the royal stronghold of the Darians, the Bernicians at this stage. And maybe his first wife, Baba, was in residence, and that's why Bamburgh is called Bamburgh. It's Bamburgh, it's Baba's town. So again, not the best start to a marriage, I imagine, for poor Acca. But they go on to have 6 children. But in around 613, Ethelthryth basically meets his maker, and Edwin has his revenge and kills Ethelthryth in a battle. They lure him down to the Isle of Lindsey, which is in Lincolnshire, and he's killed there in an ambush. So Edwin takes over the throne of Daria legitimately, and again then has this subjugated power over Bernicia. Tries to link them, but that's sort of the thing that's going on. But Acca, as his sister, doesn't say, "Oh, Edwin, darling, it's lovely to see you, brother dearest, isn't that great?" She knows that her children are a legitimate political threat to Edwin, so she flees. She leaves Bamburgh and goes to Iona, basically. Well, goes over to Delrita, which is a Scottish tribe up in the Strathclyde area, and seeks refuge with them. They would have legitimately been able to kill her or give her back as a hostage to Edwin, but they don't. They give her refuge. The 5 sons go to the monastery on Iona, and Acca and her daughter Eb, who is Saint Eb or Saint Abba of Eb's head, they go to a female monastery on a nearby island. The name of the island is lost. The female monastery has gone. We don't know where they go, but they sort of at this stage go quiet in terms of Anglo-Saxon history. But of course they would, because this is written by Bede, who was a man who just left all the women out. Basically, they don't get a fair trot on this. But anyway, that's another story, another day. Right. So basically, Edwin rules until 633, when he's killed by Cadwallader. And then at this stage, Oswald, who is a 34-year-old man, comes back to Bamburgh, and he is the legitimate heir to both Bernicia and Daria, unites the two kingdoms, and this creates Northumbria. So that is north of the Humber all the way up to Edinburgh. That is Northumbria. So it's a massive kingdom, and it very quickly becomes the most powerful kingdom in Britain. And so Britain is traditionally, we don't have the Scottish border, etc. So it's the biggest kingdom, and therefore he becomes more or less the overlord of the country. So at that stage, 634, Bamburgh was the capital of Britain. Bamburgh was like London. It was that big. So that's sort of what's happening politically. But what he comes back to is he basically finds, having been brought up on Iona with the Columbus monastery, he's come back to these pagans. He's been brought up in this Celtic Christian tradition, to find a nation of heathens that he has to teach. So for that, he calls back to Iona for some help. They send one bishop first, who has a terrible time and goes back. This is recorded in the annals of Iona. He goes back and says that the Northumbrians are heathens of the worst kind. They cannot be taught. They're awful. There's nothing you can do for them. So at the back of the room, a monk speaks up and says, "Oh, actually, maybe you should just be a bit nicer and listen to them a bit more, maybe." And so they all go, "Well, if you're so smart, you go." And that's Aidan. So Aidan arrives in 635 in Bamburgh and builds his first church on the site of St. Aidan's Church in Bamburgh, because that's where Oswald is. And so that's where he starts his Christian mission. And he would go out to Northumbrians and preach, and Oswald would go with him. King Oswald would go with him and translate the Old English. So that's from the Irish to Old English. So it was a remarkable partnership. And also at that stage, he was given the island of Lindisfarne to set up his first monastery. The parallels between Lindisfarne and Iona are quite remarkable. There's a craggy heath. The churches are built near to it. There's sheltered harbours, etc. But the difference is obviously with Lindisfarne, it's a tidal island, so you can get on and off it easily. But the indivisibility between Lindisfarne and Bamburgh is really significant and really important, because if you're going to teach a Christian message to a nation, you have to be able to see the person who's basically paying the wages, and that was Oswald. So why am I so excited about this story, and why have I just told you all of that? Well, it's because the cemetery, the radiocarbon dates from the cemeteries date the cemetery to 650 to about 800. So that is an early Anglo-Saxon cemetery. So the supposition that it was a Christian burial site was right. They do date to that period. So much so they date to that period. This is the period of the conversion. So actually these are Aidan's first converts. These are the Christian converts. So these people would have heard Aidan speak. And that's quite a remarkable thing from an archaeological point of view, to be able to take something that's, you know, I wouldn't say you talk about the Northern Saints as myth or folklore, but that, you know, these are quite abstract notions. And actually these people knew them personally, and that is remarkable. As I said earlier, the preservation was remarkable as well. So it gives us this really unique insight into Anglo-Saxon period. As I said, the grave goods were really sparse, and it was just very, very, very few things, such as like this is a bone cope. So it wasn't, you know, as I say, no Sutton Hoo garnets in this instance. So basically, just to give you a little idea of the cemetery population, I'm just going to really quickly talk about 7 skeletons in particular. But basically, the headline is it's a mixed cemetery, men and women and children. So it's an average population. It's not a cemetery of the war dead or anything particular. But the standout sort of thing that strikes you first is, as a population, they are incredibly robust. They're very healthy in terms of they must have had quite a good diet. We've got more evidence for diet later on, but they also had appalling teeth. Absolutely, without exception, almost every single one of them had abscesses. Their breath must have stunk, and they would have been in a lot of pain basically most of the time. But that was a common factor, and I'm sure that's just how they got on. So this skeleton that you're looking at here is a Bamburgh lady. Now we know that because the enamel is this thing called isotopes, and your isotopes hold the mineral trace of the environment you were in when your teeth grew and the environment you lived in. So we can tell from isotopes exactly where people come from. It's different from DNA. DNA is your sort of code, but as we know, we're all sort of a mix across Europe. So DNA doesn't tell you where somebody comes from. It tells you where their ancestors might have evolved from. It doesn't tell you where somebody comes from. So that's the difference here. Also, extracting ancient DNA can be difficult and very expensive, so that wasn't undertaken in this instance. But isotope analysis was actually relatively new when they started this excavation in 1999, and they were lucky to secure a 100% grant in order to be able to sample every single skeleton. And again, that's a really unusual thing as well to have happen. So we've sampled 100% of the skeletons that have teeth. So this is a Bamburgh lady. We know that from her isotopes, but also what's interesting is that less than 10% of this cemetery population come from Bamburgh. The rest come from wider Britain, particularly the West, but from Europe, Scandinavia. So it's a really, really interesting and cosmopolitan cemetery. This skeleton, you can already see, is much more robust than the last one. And this is a male skeleton. You can see the size of those legs. He was very tall. He has a sort of evidence of dreadful gout showing on his toes, on his joints, particularly his toes and his hands. So again, indicative of a really, really, really rich diet. But he was probably in his late 20s or 30s when he died. And his isotopes tell us that he came from somewhere like Italy, possibly. You can see immediately this skeleton is much more slight than the previous one you're looking at. So this is a female skeleton. Also look at the width, the width of the pelvis is also indicative of female skeleton. But she was in her mid-20s when she died. And what's interesting about her is she has two bits of evidence on her skeleton. She's got a condition which we colloquially call a weaver's bottom, which basically means where the muscles on the thighs sit next to the femur, that becomes a really exaggerated pattern, and it actually shows on the femur. And that is from continually crouching, getting up and down from a crouching position. So that means your muscles become really big on your thighs. And she also had a nick in her front tooth from continually holding something between her teeth, like a needle or thread. So if you add this to the evidence that we know these people are from the castle, we think we're looking at the cemetery of the courtesans and artisans of the court of St. Oswald, and we can actually start to speculate what they were doing for a living. And what's interesting is, this is somebody that's come from Southern Ireland. The skeleton before was from Italy. So this means that people are traveling, 1,400 years ago, people were traveling to Bamburgh from all over Europe. So again, back to that point, migration is nothing new. And actually the sort of cultural heritage that's celebrated internationally with like the Lindisfarne Gospels is a result of this melting pot of all these cultures coming together and bringing, and this makes the golden age of Northumbria. And it's a really, really important thing to remember, especially at the moment. So this skeleton is in a crouch position, which is quite interesting in itself, but still east to west and no grave goods. But this skeleton is of an elderly man, 60 something plus, and his isotope suggests he comes from Scandinavia. He dates to around 700. Now, traditionally, we all go on about the Viking raid on Lindisfarne being the first sort of raid on this country. But actually, this cemetery gives us evidence that we were trading, at least, or interacting with our Scandinavian colleagues, cousins, quite a long way before that. So the raid on Lindisfarne, which everybody, was very shocked about, was not a surprise really, because they were coming backwards and forwards and sailing past Lindisfarne at that stage anyway, so they knew about Lindisfarne. But what's also interesting is the Scandinavian skeletons, except one, tend to be male, and they tend to favour a crouched position. So when you start to think about that, it's quite interesting. Are they taking a Scandinavian burial tradition and adapting it to this new Christian way? So no grave goods in east-west, but they're just harking back to perhaps something that they would have done in their native countries. This is a much, much smaller skeleton, as I'm sure you all can see. This is a child's skeleton, the really large head. And this skeleton was probably about 9 or 10 when they died. The infant mortality is high in the Anglo-Saxon period. If you can get past your teens, you've got a fairly good chance of getting a lot further, but getting past your teens was difficult. Basically, this skeleton is interesting from an archaeological point of view, but if any of you've got 10-year-old children at home or grandchildren or something, you will know they have a mouth full of teeth, because both the baby teeth and the adult teeth are in the skull at this stage. So that meant they've got 2 hits on the isotopes with this skeleton. So the adult teeth, which form in early childhood, suggests that this child spent their early childhood somewhere quite warm, like the south of France. But the interesting thing is her baby teeth, which would have formed when she was a fetus in her mother's womb, suggests she was somewhere even warmer, possibly the south of Spain or even northern Africa. So in the space of 10 years, this child has crossed across 2 continents to end up in Bamburgh. What are the reasons for that? We can't know. But because there's so much sort of religious change, Christianity, this is a really interesting concept of this, it was a new concept. And actually what it's teaching is, you don't necessarily, you get to heaven by being good. Religion prior to that is you get to heaven by being, very great and killing people in battle and reward for endeavor. But actually this teaching was very egalitarian. And actually, if you're just good and nice, you get rewarded in the afterlife, which is a great sort of a very interesting concept for Anglo-Saxons. And maybe that was why they came, but then maybe it's the same as now. It's economic or it's political, who knows, but people were traveling far and wide, and that must have been a remarkable undertaking. So this skeleton, the canny amongst you will notice it's missing its head here, obviously, and also it's missing its lower legs. Again, as it might have moved during, sort of post deposition, those might have moved, but certainly the head is interesting. But this is one of the only skeletons. This skeleton behind is face down, prone. There's different interpretations about why people were buried in this position. This could be because actually this person hasn't confessed close enough to death to be worthy of facing our Lord at the second coming. So they're already in a sort of diffident position. But anyway, this skeleton that you're looking at here is the one we're talking about. This is one of the only ones to show weapon trauma. And basically, this has evidence of a massive sword blow to the shoulder. This should be a ball here. So the sword blow has taken off this part of the ball of the humerus, but it's also taken off a straight, clean swipe through the pelvis. The pelvis should go like that. You can actually see it if I go back. You can see the straight swipe there. you see. So this has got weapon trauma, and it's one massive blow all the way through from the shoulder. It goes through the ribs, it shows in the ribs, and it even is a nick in the patella in the kneecap. So it's a single sword blow all the way through. It's the only one with weapon trauma, but because traditionally battles and fighting didn't take place in settlements. Traditionally, the tribes would meet at river crossings for battle, and that's where battles, and so they bury their dead there. So it's an unusual find, but incredibly interesting. He was probably about 19 when he died. We can be very specific about the age of death in teenage years, because your clavicle, which is your collarbone, interestingly enough, is one of the first to form in the fetus, is actually one of the last to fuse fully in a full-grown adult. And we know that the distal end finally fully forms at 21. So prior to that, this is in 3 pieces, the clavicle. That's why, you know, rugby players break them quite easily, especially young boys are always breaking these. So his distal end wasn't fully formed, fully fused at this stage. So we know he was about 19 when he died. But because he doesn't have a head, we don't have any teeth, so we don't know where he came from. Now, this is the least photogenic of the 7 that I was talking about. I think this is the 7th. So, but he is probably the most interesting in terms of the links to our Anglo-Saxon story, because he was radiocarbon dated as well as all the other work that was done, and his death dates to about 650. So he's a direct contemporary of Aidan and Oswald. But coupled with that is his isotopes. Well, he was 50 years old, 8 years of age when he died, so he's the same age as Oswald. And his isotopes from his teeth tell us that he came from Iona. So this is a man that would have known Oswald and Aidan from childhood, basically, and he must have come back to Bamburgh with Oswald when he came in 634. That's the only reason why you can have him here. So it's actually, not only is it contemporary, not only somebody that heard them preach, this is probably Oswald's friend, which again, from an archaeological point of view, to be able to make links like that is just astounding. So we've got these amazing skeletons, we've got these amazing stories, we've got this amazing preservation, we've got this amazing story of Northern Saints. And this wasn't being told anywhere in Bamburgh. So when we made the Bamburgh ossuary, it was an opportunity to start to use the ossuary as a focus to start telling this story. Because let's face it, without Oswald and Aidan founding their Christian mission in Bamburgh and then Lindisfarne, the sort of cultural, the early medieval significance of the Northumbrian, the Golden Age, the Lindisfarne Gospels, in fact, Durham Cathedral would not exist without this happening first in Bamburgh, and nowhere's telling that. So this is what we're trying to do. So to do that, we have opened the crypt to the public, but obviously it wasn't that straightforward, because that's the stairs before and that's the stairs now. So we had to improve access. This is what we've done with our Heritage Fund money, is improve the access down so you can get into the crypt. And the crypt was opened and blessed by the Bishop of Newcastle in November last year. And we've had a few closures since because of COVID, but it is open to the public daily. And when you go down the steps, you come onto a platform which takes out the trip hazard of that additional staircase when you get in, and you can see into the ossuary beyond, as you can see there, and you can see the stack of boxes. But then what you do is you press the button, or now you wave your hand over a PIR sensor, because we don't want anybody touching buttons anymore. And there's a short projection, which basically tells the story of Aidan coming to Bamburgh and all these people migrating to Bamburgh 1,400 years ago. And the illustrations are done, they're lino cut, and there's a slight animation. So it's not Mickey Mouse, it's very tastefully done, and it tells that story really beautifully. There's also a website, which bamburghbones.org, which basically is a digital ossuary. So instead of being like continental Europe and doing a fan of femurs across the wall, what we've done is we've actually taken all the information that we have, and that's digitally accessible for everybody. So anybody can go and look at this. You can look at each skeleton. And then each skeleton has a code word, which is an Anglo-Saxon word. So if you want to brush up on your Anglo-Saxon, please do. And each one has different word. It's quite interesting in itself. And then also there's sort of stories about Bamburgh and more about the crypt, because there's other things in the crypt other than the ossuary. There's the Forsters, and there's all sorts of beautiful things. And also it's a 12th century architectural gem, so it's worth visiting for that alone. And then at the back of the church, we've put in some touch screens, which means you can see the film if you don't want to go down to the crypt, but also you can access that database. And we've put in some additional interpretation, and we've got guides and training But also we had a massive sort of, you know, year of outreach planned. We've commissioned a map, which is really basic things like get your Sarah Faruqi to do a map which actually has the ossuary on it, things like that. And actually when we started doing this project, we did some survey work up in the car park here. About 80% of replies said they didn't even know that Bamburgh had a church. So it's about basically getting people to go up there. It's not about getting more people to come to Bamburgh. We don't really need to do that, as you all know from this summer. But this is more about getting those people that do come to Bamburgh to learn a bit more about its Anglo-Saxon significance and the fact that without Bamburgh and without that church on that site, which is where Aidan founded his first church, Little Timber Church, we wouldn't have Lindisfarne as we know it. We wouldn't have the Gospels. We wouldn't have Durham Cathedral, because the reason we got Durham Cathedral is all from the cult of St. Cuthbert. St. Cuthbert was sitting on a hillside as a shepherd of 10 years of age when he saw the soul of St. Aidan ascending to heaven on his death in 655, and that made him join the monastery. So him joining the monastery then resulted in him being on Lindisfarne, which had been founded by Aidan. So if you don't have Aidan here, you don't have Cuthbert. If you don't have Cuthbert, you don't have Durham. And that's quite a remarkable thing. And it's just, you know, good that maybe Bamburgh says, actually, it comes from here. Other places in the northeast tell their Anglo-Saxon story beautifully. You know, Yevering, Millfield, Jarrow, all these places, Hexham, they're all telling the Anglo-Saxon, but nobody was telling it in Bamburgh. And without Bamburgh, they don't have anything to say. So this is basically, it's redressing that balance, basically, and trying to just get a little bit of recognition that this is where it all starts from. But as I say, it's not necessarily about getting more people to visit. It's about getting those that do come to learn a little bit more. So we did have a year of outreach. This is about one of the only events we managed to do. We have a skeleton called Maud who goes out with us. So if any of you want to have a fiddle with a skeleton, please let me know and I'll drop a box off. But we have got lots planned for next year in the hope that we are slowly becoming slightly more confident that we might be able to do more events in the summer. And we're working with a theatre company, and they're going to be putting on some myths and legends based around the Laidley Worm. Laidley Worm legend is an Anglo-Saxon story. The king in that story is reputed to be Oswald's grandfather, so it does all link in. So the Laidley Worm is related to, well, he would have been Oswald's aunt, in fact, wouldn't he? So there's all linking into that, and the Beowulf and all the traditional epic Anglo-Saxon poems. So we'll be looking for some extras to play parts in that sort of theatre experience if you want. But also I'm looking to any volunteers who want to come and join the project. So that'd be lovely. And that is me finished, I think. Yes.
Does anyone have any questions for Jessica?
No hard ones? Joyce's the JC is flashing at me. I couldn't hear any of that.
I can't even turn
I can see you now.
Right, I'm having some serious technical issues. Joyce, when you see and ask a question, just raise your hand.
Oh, there she is.
Oh. Joyce, were you trying to ask the question?
No, I was just turning the microphone back on.
Did anyone else have any questions for Jessica? No? That's an easy one. Maybe you just said so much that everyone.
Packed it in.
Exactly. I don't know whether you're looking for any specific roles, Jessica. Maybe email them over so we can them out.
Yeah, I'll nothing at the moment, obviously, because we're closed. The church is open for private prayer, but we feel that stretching the truth a bit to say come into the crypt for private prayer, because it is very much a sort of an interpretation thing. So we're closed at the moment, but we hope to be back up and open. And then as we get into next year, once we feel confident, we'll be putting out more sort of volunteer opportunities, particularly what I want to do, like a graveyard survey, and then cross-referencing that with the census data, etc. So there's all sorts of things like that to come along, as well as the festivals and some creative arts, creative writing. Those things are happening as well. But again, can't be sure until. Sorry, I'm getting that lovely echo there as well.
Do you want to stop recording? Sorry everyone, I forgot to say at the start that the session will be recorded. The idea being we'll put